everybody, welcome to Tomato Heaven. Thank you so much for coming out on this kind of chilly late April afternoon, evening to share with each other and for a little tomato talk. So today we're going to do a couple different activities. We're going to talk mostly about like what are the next steps following the starting from seed. So when you have like little tomatoes, and then it's a good idea to step them up. So it's like plant them into a bigger container. So if they're like this, and then planting them into a bigger container like this would be the next step. And then when the weather gets much warmer, then the step after that is hardening off. So we're going to talk about what hardening off is. And then after that, we're going to talk about planting out. So that's planting like out in the garden. But we would never do like the planting out in the garden on a day like today because it's way too cold. And even some of these tomato plants that were inside the nice warmness, they're like not looking very happy right now. So they're very much wanting for you to step them up and then take them home into the warm inside again. So after we do the intro, then we're going to have a hands-on section where you're actually going to step up your own tomatoes. Some that have started from seed, and I mean they've all started from seed, but some I started and some are courtesy of GreenThumb. And my name is Maureen O'Brien. I am newly retired from the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and I'm really happy to be here as a volunteer today to share my love of tomatoes and to learn from all of you too. So let's get going. I'm really happy that folks at 615 Green allowed us to use the garden today for this workshop. I've been a member here for many years, since '96, and I wanted to start by acknowledging the land here. So as residents of what is now called Brooklyn, we live in Lenape-Hoking, the unceded territory of the Lenape people, who were the first stewards of this land. Although genocide and forced migration pushed the Lenape west and north to rebuild their homes in what is now Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, their connection to their ancestral homeland will not be erased. As we participate in this gathering from many homelands, let us commit to recognizing and uprooting injustice. In the words of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, in these times of great transition, we root ourselves in the land. There is work ahead of us. Planting seeds, tending the land, cultivating beauty, and enriching the world's biodiversity are all parts of the work. And thank you. This is a BBG version that we're using right now. Might be refined or adjusted in the future. Okay, so I guess to start out, you probably could guess that I really, really, really love growing tomatoes. It's my favorite thing to grow. It's my favorite thing to eat. And kind of like once October has passed, I kind of really don't eat tomatoes very much until the next year because they just kind of taste like, you know, I would say nothing special, but they just kind of taste like nothing. So I'm very fond of homegrown tomatoes. So one of the things about tomatoes too, that people who have been to the classes before, is that there are a lot of different kinds of tomatoes. And since we have different kinds of tomatoes today to step up, I thought maybe we would go over those. So I'm gonna pass these seed packs around. Actually, would you remind me your name?
Sandra.
Sandra. So Sandra, if you could, so this is Paul Robeson. That's a beefsteak tomato. That's one of those really big beefy kind that are really good to stuff or for sandwiches. They kind of take a while to get fruit from them, so they take a long season. This is a kind of heirloom container tomato, which is called Tasmanian chocolate. And this is kind of like a plum-shaped tomato, but if you have, you know, I think of a raised bed as like a big container. So these are actually really good for small space growing. And tomatoes that have the word container or patio or mini or dwarf in the name are usually good for raised beds or containers. So you can. This is Amish paste tomatoes. So we have some of those here today. So paste tomatoes are kind of like oblong. They're sometimes called Roma tomatoes, sometimes called plum tomatoes, and sometimes called paste tomatoes. So it's a little bit confusing with all these different tomato shapes, especially when they're named after other fruit. But these are a little bit drier and meatier, and these are really good for sauces, but you can still use them for salads or sandwiches. Then here is Maraglobe. So this is called a slicing tomato. When you take a slice of this, it's like a very round, spherical tomato. A slice of it is almost exactly this shape of a standard size piece of bread. So it makes a great tomato if you're going to make a lot of tomato sandwiches or BLTs or other things like that. Go. And then here is chocolate cherry pole tomato. So this is a very dark colored, almost black tomato, really delicious, kind of winey taste, very, very sweet, and it grows really tall. So that's the pole part. So it'll need some, pretty much all tomatoes need some support. So the one thing, cherry tomatoes actually tend to start producing sooner. And the cherry, another thing that's in the cherry kind of category is like cherry tomatoes, pear tomatoes, plum, and grape tomatoes, not plum tomatoes, sorry, those are like the paste tomatoes. So grape, cherry, and pear are just kind of small size, and you can start harvesting early. So I usually grow some of each so that I can start harvesting tomatoes right away, because I just like to say like, oh, look, we have tomatoes, or those are actually really good to like just snack on if you're doing weeding. And then the ones like the beefsteak ones, like Paul Robeson, ones like Brandywine, those take a longer season. They tend to you can start harvesting those like in September, but it's a very big tomato, so they need a long season. We also have today some chocolate cherry tomatoes. Oh, here they are. Chocolate cherry, and then a medium-sized tomato called Valencia. Questions so far about tomato types or sizes or yes.
Do you have like a favorite tomato, or is it?
I do. Next question.
Is it here?
No, actually, my favorite is Cherokee Purple. I love Cherokee Purple, and they're kind of like, almost like a beefsteak. I think they have the most delicious flavor. They're kind of winey. Sometimes they're a little bit fussy to grow, and they're a little bit disease prone, but those are my absolute favorite. But I kind of like all of them. So there's determinate tomatoes and indeterminate tomatoes. So determinate tomatoes are ones that they tend to ripen kind of all at the same time. So there's a tomato variety, a paste tomato that I grew last year, a paste or a Roma or a plum tomato for sauce, called Supremo, and that's a determinate tomato. So the kind of vine gets filled with tomatoes, and then they kind of all ripen at once, and that's really good if you're a tomato company that makes ketchup, or you want to do canning or something like that, because they all ripen at the same time. Indeterminate tomatoes ripen over a long season. So once indeterminate tomatoes, once they start ripening, it's important to pick them so that they keep setting more fruit. When I first did the Supremo tomatoes, I harvested them all, and I was like, oh, those were great. I canned them, I made salsa, and then there were no more tomatoes, and I was like, what did I do wrong? And then I looked at the packages, and I was like, oh, they were determinate tomatoes. But that's very commonly used for growing for something like canning, Other questions? Could you say that again? Yes. So is there a correlation between the size of the tomato and the time it takes to grow? Yes. So cherry tomatoes, which are smaller, they will ripen more quickly than a beefsteak tomato, which has to kind of grow to a full size. So, tomatoes too, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about planting out, is that they need a lot of resources. They need a lot of soil, they need a lot of sunlight, because they grow they grow stems, and they grow leaves, and then they grow flowers, and then they grow fruit. So they need all of those things to kind of, get to the final product, which the soonest one would be like a cherry tomato, or even like a mini cherry tomato. And then the longest season would be for something like a big beefsteak. So something, for example, like lettuce, it just basically grows the leaves. So, it has, and roots, but it doesn't have to make a stem, it doesn't have to make flowers for you to get something to eat. Now, of course, it does make a stem and flowers to make the seeds, but as far as to get like produce from your garden plot, that can take, that's why lettuce can take a little bit of shade or maybe a little bit less than ideal conditions. But tomatoes originated from Central and South America, so they are near the equator and they like it hot. Hot, hot, hot. Say it after me. Hot, hot, hot. Sun, sun, sun. Lots of space, lots of space, lots of space. So they need ideal conditions. So it's good to we'll talk a little bit more about that. Any other questions so far about tomato types? Okay, all right, good. Let's see, let me look at how much time, because I can just go on talking and you don't want to hear me talk the whole time. Okay, so we talked about the different kinds. Right, here I said yes. Cherokee purple, my absolute favorite one. And did everybody get a tip sheet so far? Okay, so you can follow along with that if you want. But we are kind of going into now the stepping up. So these are little tomatoes which were started from seed. They have 2 to 3 sets of true leaves. So the very first leaves that come out on the bottom that are kind of smooth around, those are the cotyledons. So that's what was kind of covering up the seed. So once they germinated and that came back, then the ones that are spiky are the true leaves. So it's important that the tomato have a couple sets of leaves before you step them up. So it'll be a little sturdier. And what we have in this container, thank you to GreenThumb for bringing this, is some, we have potting soil. So it's important, since these are still going to be inside, to use a soilless, sterile potting soil. So sometimes they have a combination of like peat or coir, sometimes some sand or compost. You can make your own actually with coir. 1/3 coir, 1/3 sifted compost, and 1/3 sand is a good homemade recipe. But it's important that it doesn't have regular garden soil in it, because that has naturally occurring bacteria, which isn't bad, and fungi, which isn't bad, but like because there aren't breezes and air movement inside, that it can cause like the tomato plant to rot right at the center, right at the soil level. So if you've ever had tomatoes and like they're growing and they're like really good and they're growing up like this, and then you come out one morning and they're like this, and it's like really skinny right where the soil is, that's called damping off. So to avoid that, always use a sterile medium and always water from the bottom. Okay. So anyway, so this is the soil. I moistened this with a little bit of regular water, and it feels like, well, actually this is a little bit drippy. So it feels like a wrung out sponge. I'm going to add a little bit more to this. So the idea is you don't want too many drips, because you don't want the soil to be too dry, because then the little rootlets will come in contact with like dry stuff and it'll like suck the water out of them. But you don't want it to be too wet that they're kind of almost drowning in the soil. So it's just kind of like, the feeling of a wrung out sponge. So I'm gonna squeeze this. So there's kind of like, it almost looks like tears welling up in between my fingers. That's okay. That's okay. But no big drips. And now I'm filthy. Sorry. Okay, so these are some clean plastic pots that we're reusing. I washed them all out really good with like super hot water and soap. You can also use like a light bleach solution or peroxide, but I just use soap and water, but very hot water. And then these are these made out of, are these cow pots? Are they paper? Peat? Okay, so these are peat. So these are actually biodegradable. And then these, of course, which aren't pots, but some of our little starts. So these actually, which look a little bit sad, I'm sorry to say, but they're just a little, they looked actually fine before they came out in the cold. These are made in soil blocks. So I'm really trying to use like less plastic or no plastic. So this is a special tool that they sell at Johnny's that you kind of have this tool that you kind of load up with soil, and then you can kind of squeeze it onto a tray, and it comes out these little individual blocks with holes in them, and then it's just like one seed for every hole. You water from the bottom, and then all these little starts. I had one of these metal trays just filled with tomato starts, and actually that's a good way to grow a lot if you don't have that much space. Although then when you have to step them up, then they're in bigger pots, then you need to find some more space. But it's a way to kind of keep some peace at home. Enough said about that. Okay. All right, so I'm going to take this this nice clean pot, which has the soil like a wrung out sponge, not too drippy. I'm just going to put like a scoop in here, and then I will get this little start, which is this is one of the beefsteaks, so this is a Paul Robeson. And one of the things that's cool, you can see the roots here. This, because it's kind of a separate block, it's almost like root pruned. It's not like all, like the roots all bundled around. But I am gonna just like very gently kind of like rough it up a little bit before I put it in here. And then I'm just gonna add some more soil lightly around here. And I'm just gonna kind of tap it lightly because we still want there to be air. So it doesn't have to be pushed down too tight, otherwise there's no airspace. And the plants need space to grow. So it shouldn't be all squished up. Okay. There you go. Okay, then
So that's
you're gonna I'm taking you home right after this workshop is over. So then what I would do after this, after taking it home, is fill this up with water and then water it from the bottom. And then put it in, then take it out, let it drip off, and then put it in a nice sunny spot. Okay. I feel like a really bad gardener, like showing you this plant, and the rest of them look like this too. These are a little bit hardened off. Okay, so these are used to being outside of it. Did these grow with GreenThumb, do you know? Okay, so let's see. So let's take, I'm gonna do another one. So this, of course, it's a little different because this is in a little 6-pack. So this first one is called a black cherry. So I'm just gonna squeeze this bottom here, or take a knife. I tend to like not have that many special tools, so I like to use a knife and fork, like just a regular knife and fork that you have at home, to just pull this out. And I'll use this peat pot. So this peat pot, you'll notice it doesn't have a hole in the bottom. So that's because it'll just kind of leach some of the things out. But if you're using like something like an old paper coffee cup or a plastic yogurt container, it's important to have a hole so it'll have drainage. Like this kind of drains without a hole because it's paper. Does that make sense to people? Okay. And then, yeah, okay. I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of soil in here, and I'm supporting the whole plant. I'm just kind of roughing it up a little bit so you can see the roots, and I am putting it in there, just sprinkling this around a little bit. So it's important to support the plant because it can grow new roots and it can grow new leaves, but if the stem breaks off, it's kind of, you know, a goner. Okay, and then that was called black cherry. Very important to make sure you have the tag ready to go in, maybe even before that's planted. Okay, and then that I would do the same thing. I'm not going to water it right now because then it'll be sopping wet to take home. So it'll be good enough to water them when they get home from the bottom. So you always want to water it from the bottom when they're inside, and that helps prevent the damping off thing. So we just always water from the bottom. Where do we always water from?
Bottom.
Very good. Okay, great. Okay, so questions so far? Yes.
How often do you recommend watering? Like, how often should you let it sit in the tray?
Right, that's a great thing, and especially now because they'll be stepped up. So I would say like maybe water once or twice a week. It really depends on the conditions in your home, in your apartment. So it shouldn't look, I would say like letting it sit in water for like 10 minutes and then let it drain out is good. And you feel the top. If the top feels cool or moist, it's good. If it feels like sopping wet and it's glossy, it's a little bit too watered, make sure it drains. But if you ever look at your tomatoes, if they're slumped over like this, that's because of the cold. If it feels dry or hot, then you can water it. And even when it's in your garden plot, so if you have, let's just say this is like your garden plot, if you stick your finger in and about 1 inch down it feels hot or dry, then you need to water. If it feels cool or moist, then you're probably good. And tomatoes like deep watering, so it's better to water a tomato like once they're planted out, like a whole lot once a week or twice a week. Just depends on the rain. But when they're inside, like if it's near a window and then it gets really hot, you might need to water it more often than if it's in a room that's kind of on the cool side. But they like heat, but not radiator heat. That's too hot. Other questions? Yes.
Can tomatoes tolerate being dried out, or is it good to not let that happen?
It's good to not let that happen. They can tolerate it a little bit being dried out, but they like kind of even watering. It just kind of helps them be more stable, and then they don't have to kind of like, if they're in a stable condition, then they don't have to kind of like use the reserve energy to kind of bounce back, and they can just keep going forward with growing their leaves or their flowers or whatever. Great questions. Yes.
When you're stepping them up, do you ever want to like I have seedlings in there, like I want to say a bit leggy.
Yes.
Would I ever bury them a little bit?
Yes. So that's a really good thing. So if you have some seedlings, like actually some of these could be planted kind of more deeply. So and actually these ones were already planted deeply. So let me just do that with, well, let me see. I might need another one. It's good to kind of have 2 or 3 sets of leaves, but let's just say you have like this one. If we had a deeper pot, if we had a pot that was like this deep, I would just pick all these little ones off the side and bury it so that only the very top is sticking out. And I often do that when I'm planting out in the garden. I usually kind of wait till then because I try not to get them too leggy. But this one, you can see, this one actually was quite a bit taller. You can see that first, well, it's actually up here now. There was just like one set of leaves sticking out when I transplanted this. But one of the things that I wanted to show you about transplanting is, let's see, this is a Paul Robeson, and it was stepped up on April 4th. And, oh, I'm sorry. And this is a Paul Robeson, and this was stepped up on April 4th. So you can see how much bigger this one got, how this has a much thicker stem and is looking a little bit more robust, even though it's probably freezing cold too, because it's been out here. Okay. Other questions? Did you have a question, Linda? Okay. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is we're going to go over to the tables. Oh wow, there's a tiny little bit of sunshine over there. And on the table there's some of the starts that have the soil blocks and some of them that are in these containers. So they pretty much all have tags next to them. So there will be Brandywine tomatoes, Valencia tomatoes, and the chocolate cherry. And then there are the ones that we looked at before, the Paul Robeson beefsteak, Amish paste, Tasmanian chocolate, chocolate cherry, and there was one other kind. I can't remember.
Chocolate cherry.
Oh, Mariglobe.
Mariglobe.
Mariglobe. So I think that there's enough that people can step up 2, 3. I think everybody 3 or 4. Wait, how many people? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so I think we have plenty of tomatoes, so you could step up like 3 or 4 tomatoes to take home. Does that sound good, Mara? Yeah, 3 or 4. Okay. So so we're gonna take a pause here, and we have a question. Yes. Right. So yes, so after we step up, so I like to use either diluted fish emulsion, double diluted fish emulsion, like watering from the bottom, or diluted compost tea, watering from the bottom. I mean, you could use a granular, but one of the things about tomatoes is they are heavy feeders, and they like a boost, but too much nitrogen is not good for them because they grow. It makes kind of them have a flush of leaves, and that can kind of make them a little bit more attractive to pests. I guess you could. I mean, I tend to just use the fish emulsion. Has anyone else used granular fertilizer with tomatoes? Okay, and does that usually work for you? Yeah. So I think that could work good. And if you wanted to put it in your mix, you could do that. Or you could do it once you plant them out. Yes. So this is soilless potting mix. You could use, sometimes there's special like seed starting mixes, potting soil mix. They're all fine for this stage of tomatoes because you're growing them inside because it's too cold to grow them outside. And actually, I forgot to say, the reason that we start them inside to begin with is like if you started them from seed outside, by the time the soil is 60 degrees and really warmed up and they germinate, you're not going to get any tomatoes. It's going to be like Thanksgiving and they'll all be dead before you would get tomatoes because we don't live near the equator. It's just too cold for them. What we're doing is we're kind of like making the conditions that they can start growing, have them inside, and then we kind of get them used to the outside since they originated from close to the equator in Central and South America. Okay, hi. Yes.
How often, I don't know if thank you so much. How often do you compost? I don't know if he asked, like throughout the summer.
How often do you add compost? Yeah. So when they're inside, I usually water them with diluted compost tea or diluted fish emulsion once every 2 weeks, so that I don't use it every time I water. And then during the season, when they get planted out, I usually add a shovel full of compost to the hole, and then in the middle of the season, put a little ring around of compost, a finished compost. And then towards the end of the season, give them a little more compost because they like it. And you can use like a tomato fertilizer or whatever, but you know what? I'm really cheap. I try not to buy stuff, and I'm able to make my own compost, and we make compost here, so I usually just use compost. I use compost pretty much as a cure-all.
Yep.
Other questions? Yes.
What would be the benefits to stepping them up multiple times before planting them out versus like one?
Right. So what would be the advantage of stepping them up multiple times? Well, the more soil that the plant has, the more kind of robust plant that you're going to have. So it really depends on your space. I tend to just step them up once, just for the timing. I try to kind of time it so that they're going to be ready to go out. I like to plant them out in the end of May, which is kind of late, but they catch up and they really like warm soil. You could do that if you have the space. It's just a matter of space. And then you probably, like, if they're bigger like this, you'll probably start getting ripe fruit a little earlier than you would if you started with something smaller. Great question. Okay, so we have our tomatoes. So take them home. When you get them home, what are you going to do when you take them home? Because I think they're thirsty. Water them? How are you going to water them?
From the bottom.
From the bottom, of course, I know. And keep them in a warm, sunny spot. So not on a radiator, but if you have a good sun, and then like turn them every day so they don't start growing like out the window. Or keep them with grow lights, yes. Yeah, so having them with a grow light too, and the grow light should be, pretty close to them, so you don't have to turn them if you have grow lights, or if you have a grow tent. Okay, so just keep raising them. The other thing that you can do is that you can like very gently stroke them every day. You can kind of pet them a little bit, so that makes strong stems for tomatoes because it kind of simulates like the air blowing back and forth. So you can see how thick this stem is because I like pet them every day. Sometimes I sing to them a little bit. Linda, you're the one who taught me that singing to tomatoes really helps them. So continue to care for them, make sure they're watered, make sure they have sun, and then basically just keep it going until it gets time to plant them out. So, we just passed April 15th, which is the supposed frost-free date. Actually the 10th. Between the 10th and the 20th is the frost-free date. So just because we won't have a frost, meaning 32 degrees or lower, that doesn't mean it's time for tomatoes. Maybe you can plant peas or lettuce or kale or broccoli, but tomatoes, where are tomatoes from?
Central America.
Central America, near the equator. They like warm soil. They want it hot. Okay, so the soil has to be about 60 degrees. So maybe Mother's Day would be the earliest, but I usually wait till that last week in May because I have been very impatient in the past and planted them too soon, and then what happens is they get cold, they're purple, they never really get over it. If you plant them later when it's hot, they're going to do great and they'll catch up with other things. So wait till it's hot. So then the next step, which is called, any questions about that so far? Okay, so end of May. So tomatoes want the sunniest spot in your garden. And remember, they've been inside, they've been getting individual attention, and now they're going out into the big world. So it's important to do what's called hardening off. So hardening off just means acclimating them to the outside conditions. So that means giving them a little bit more light every day, letting them get acclimated to it'll be warmer temperatures, but when it's about 2 weeks to 10 days before you're going to plant them out, just get a tray of your plants together or your one plant, and then if you're in an apartment that has if you have a place to put them outside or bring them to the community garden, you can do that, but the first couple days are going to be an hour outside and then the rest of the day inside. And then the next day you're going to be 2 hours outside and then the rest of the day inside. And then 2 days later it's going to be 3 hours outside. And then after the fourth or so day you can start letting them out a little bit longer, but try to start on a warm, overcast day. If it's super sunny and hot all of a sudden, don't take your plants out even for an hour, because what'll happen is that they'll get sun scald and all the leaves will turn white and it'll be very sad. They can bounce back, but it's better to just wait. Just waiting a couple of days sometimes for tomatoes, because you've already spent all this time and energy getting them to this point, and they just need a little special care because they're from the equator. And we are not from the equator. We're the 49th parallel or whatever it is. Okay, so just keep taking them in and out to acclimate them, and then still keep an eye on the temperature to make sure that it's not, if for some reason we get a cold snap, then don't put them out for a couple of days, even if you're supposed to You know, they should be acclimated. Just keep an eye on the weather. And then eventually, you know, they'll be outside. You'll still be petting them. Then the big day comes that you're going to plant outside. Let me see what I forgot here. Let's see. So the sunniest spot, you want to have really good garden soil. And I like to say, dig a $5 hole for a $1 plant. So dig a nice big hole that's at least twice the size of your plant. Then water the hole. So dig a big hole, a nice deep hole, so that you can kind of bury the stem, maybe even pinch some of these leaves off. Because all along this, if you plant it deep, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But anyway, when you're digging the hole, dig a big hole, water the hole, and then let the water drain out, and then water the hole again. And when I'm planting tomatoes, I like to put in a shovel full of finished compost, you know, because I like to use compost with everything. And then I like to put some crushed eggshells for calcium. Tomatoes need calcium, so it avoids that bottom end rot. If you don't have crushed eggshells, you could use a Tums tablet, which has calcium in it as like the thing that makes your tummy better. I like to put a penny for micronutrients for copper. I like to put in a rusty nail for a little iron. Everybody's like, rusty nails, you gotta be careful. What? I think it is all on the sheet. A rusty nail, penny for copper. Oh, optional, add a tablespoon of Epsom salts, which is magnesium, which helps with fruiting. And if you're really adventurous, don't put any of that stuff in, but dig a little extra deep and put a fish head in there. Then put like 4 inches of soil and then plant your tomato. Okay, so the most important thing is water it, because you just don't want your tomato touching dry soil. Okay, so then the next thing would be, whoops, that's okay, is to plant it like we were saying, plant it deeply. So I think because it's starting to get later and we're gonna have to wrap up, I'm not gonna replant this in a deeper hole. I mean, I'd like to do that, but what I'm gonna do when I plant this is I'm gonna just pinch these back. I know this looks really scary. There's pictures of it. Oh my gosh. I'm gonna pinch this all the way back like this. And then I'm gonna plant this in a bigger hole so that only this is sticking out of the top. So this is all gonna be underground. And what's gonna happen is all along here, it's gonna make roots because there's all little nodes on here and it's gonna make roots all out there. And the tomato plants are gonna get so honkin' big. They're amazing. They are amazing. Now, if your soil's not that deep, another thing that you can do, which I learned from some folks from Guyana, is actually, you know what? I will do this because it's just too much fun. We're just going to pretend that this is a raised bed, so you can plant them sideways. So you can dig a trench. So I'm just going to take this out. I'm going to support the stem. Yeah, see, I always use all my onion bags. Okay. So again, we're just pretending. This is going to take a lot of imagination. But we're just imagine that we're just going to cover this with soil, and then just this very tip will be up. And actually I usually plant my tomatoes like this. I dig a trench. They're usually a little leggy because I get really excited at Christmas time and I want to start them super early. So they're kind of long and I space them like 3 feet apart. So it's just a trench and it goes in. Make sure there's like 8 inches of soil on top of it, and it should be firm but not like too firm. And then the little end comes up, and then at that very end put the tag and a stake in there, because it's much easier to put the stake in right when you plant it than put it in later, because you might damage some roots. Okay, so planting deep or planting in a trench, you get lots more root mass. And so what happens is that then the tomato plant with all those roots has access to so many more nutrients just coming in to grow those delicious tomatoes. Questions? Yes.
When they're this size, do you want to push these extra?
I would just say leave them, because they're collecting the solar energy, just leave them until you plant them outside. So that would be once they're hardened off, they're all acclimated to outside, then you just pinch them off right when you're ready to plant. And then that's a time where once they're planted, you know, and you water it really good, you've watered the hole twice, you put your pennies, your Tums, whatever, other things that you might like, other kind of rituals that you want to do, or do some smudging or whatever. Oh, but never smoke around tomatoes. Tomatoes are really susceptible to all kind of diseases that have to do with tobacco. So don't allow smoking in your garden either. So plant it deep, water it really good. But I was saying something else about watering. Oh, and of course, so when you're watering, once it's planted outside, you don't have to water from the bottom anymore, because I mean, really, how could you? But you should water right where the plant comes up here. And I would say I like to use straw for tomatoes. So I usually, once it's planted, put down some newspaper, just regular newspaper, and then put straw or chopped leaves over top. And that mulch is gonna conserve water. So you have to water less. Questions so far? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about staking. So tomatoes need support, and plus these tomatoes are going to be so big, and they're going to be heavy with tomatoes. So a way that so I was cutting up. This is a pair of pantyhose, because you know I'm retired now. So I didn't really wear them at BBG, but anyway, so I just like to cut them into loops, pantyhose loops, which are so useful in the garden for like a gazillion things. But they're great for, I think they sell a product called soft ties for tomatoes. So here you have a little loop, and put a stake in, and I like to tie it to the stake, and then tie it around the tomato, so that it's kind of loose. You know, it's not on there super tight, and then because these are nylon, they stretch. I'm not doing a very good job tying it because I think my hands are just frozen. And then the other thing too is that this can grow through. So, you know, you can just keep adding those as needed. So that's one way to stake. Another way, which is my new favorite way, which is it's a little bit hard to show without actually planting a tomato. I'm just going to take this off. You know, there's all kinds of tomato cages, and those work fine too. But my favorite new way is to make a kind of tea trellis. So almost like just like a little tea, like two stakes. I started making one here. So there's two poles, and then put a cross pole. You can also do something like this. I mean, this is just like an old thing from a flower arrangement. Anyway, I might be confusing things, but I'll just show you what the thing is. So I like having those like little T structures, and I have one that that my partner Jeff built for us, and it's like 8 feet long. So it has like rebar, like solid, serious rebar in the ground, and wooden things on the top. So it makes this like little thing. And then what you do is you connect clothesline, because it has to be sturdy, because those tomatoes are going to be so heavy. So I get one of these U-pins from the hardware store, and I stick it in down at the base of the plant. So now we're just going to imagine that I'm like putting it up onto this like U thing. I'm like, how am I going to do this? Just give me a second. So I'll just tie it up here. Actually, one of the pictures in the PDF is a close-up of these tomatoes, so I'll send you some better pictures of it. feel a little bit like Laurel and Hardy right now.
So then you just feel like attaching the top? Like when you have the whole trellis made.
Right, when you have it, you just kind of, you're hanging it down from the pole.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right.
How many plants do you plant every year?
That's a really good question. Let me finish with this, and then I'll answer that question. Okay, so we're just imagining that these are like two poles with a cross pole, and this is just coming down from one of the things. So this is actually feels pretty sturdy, and it's totally in the ground. So what I have been doing in the last couple of years, which it actually works really well, is as the tomatoes grow, so this is like little by little, is just kind of looping them around. So it actually uses kind of like their own structure as they grow. So I don't let them get this big, but like every week I kind of like loop them around a little bit, and then they just kind of grow, and the whole weight of them is like pulling down on this structure. So it's actually easy to harvest. It's not like reaching through cages that might get a little rusty or whatever. And I kind of feel like this is also like a little bit elegant when you see like a whole row of these things and they're all kind of down. And sometimes I'll use like blue twine from straw or orange twine, that like plastic filament, just to like reuse it a couple of times before, since it doesn't biodegrade. But this is a very, very good way to trellis tomatoes. Questions? So how many tomatoes do I usually grow? Okay. The most tomatoes, so one year I harvested 320 pounds of tomatoes. And that year was like, I was just so crazy about tomatoes. But then, you know, when I would come to and this was, I was growing in Pennsylvania at kind of, you know, part of like a farm kind of thing. And, but sometimes I would be like, oh my gosh, there's so many tomatoes. Like I was so excited about having so many tomatoes. But then I was like, I had so many tomatoes. So I was like giving tomatoes to everybody. I was like, oh my gosh, staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning, like making salsa and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of went tomato crazy. I went a little bit over to the edge. But it was really great because I learned a lot about tomatoes, a lot about different problems with tomatoes, about how you can have too much of a good thing sometimes. But I mean, at least I gave them all away. And so now I usually grow in my plot that I have here, which I love, this community garden. I love this plot, but I can't grow tomatoes in it because it's too shady. So, so at this little farmette in Pennsylvania, I usually grow about like 15 to 20 tomatoes now. Maybe like 15. I grew the least amount of tomatoes that I've ever grown last year. And actually I made tons of salsa, but you know what I did? I bought the tomatoes, because I bought like 40 pounds of tomatoes and made salsa. I actually think my tomatoes are too good to make salsa with. So I just, but it was kind of like a time thing. I thought, I'm gonna grow enough so that we can always have tomatoes and have plenty to give away and eat fresh. But for the canning things, since I'm not growing determinate tomatoes all the time, and I'm not there every day of the week, now that I'm retired, I have more time, so maybe I'll start growing more. But I just thought it's a more efficient way to do it, and I usually do a big canning weekend or two with my sister and my nieces and stuff like that, so it's kind of all consolidated in one thing. So I've given up the idea of being, you know, tomato, yeah. But anyway, other questions? Yes. We're in Pennsylvania, in Upper Bucks County, near Regalsville. Yes, a little farmette. But any place in where I'm from Bushwick, any good sunny spot with warm soil, you can grow great tomatoes in Brooklyn. Okay. Other questions? I know we're all getting cold and it's starting to get dark, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. When do you pinch off? I don't know if I was still over there at the soil. When you pinch off some of the ends, I forgot what they call it.
Right. So that water. So a lot of people will pinch off extra, like in here.
Right.
So if the leaves are kind of like coming out at a right angle, and the water sprout, I think they're called. So some people like to pinch them off. You can pinch them off I usually don't pinch them off, and I've also experimented with the French pruning where you really severely prune a lot of the leaves, lets more light in, and that's okay. I feel like, I don't know, it's just not my thing. It takes too much work, maybe.
I think it's if you're trying to plant them closer together and it's more like intensive, but if you have enough space to do 3 feet apart, you probably don't need to do that.
Right. And I would say it should at least be 2 feet apart because of the amount of nutrients. And it's true that if you get, like if these, come to the top of your trellis and they're growing really good, and they're going to because you're going to have so many roots, that sometimes you can top prune it a little bit or flop it over the top if they start getting really big. And the one thing that's very important is which I think there's some tips about like getting your maximum harvest, is that like let's just say if it's like the end of August or September and you have tons of flowers but you haven't really gotten that much fruit, cut some of the flowers back. And then if it's later like in October and you have lots of little fruits and more flowers, cut every flower back and just all the energy will go into the fruit. Because the tomato is like this. The tomato is like, oh, I have all these fruits already, and I'm gonna make more tomatoes. Because the main job of the tomato is to ensure the next generation by making seeds. So if all the flowers are gone, those tomatoes are like, oh my gosh, we have to ripen some fruit right now so that we can make the seeds. So that's a way to kind of make sure that you get stuff before the harvest comes in. And then if it is gonna have a frost, just harvest everything. Because once it's frosted, it changes chemically and you shouldn't eat any tomatoes that are turned into like mush. So thank you all so much. Noe and Susan, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mara and Elena and Serena for coming, and everybody for your great questions. And please take these cold tomato plants home with you. Take a couple, empty pots or as we're cleaning up, if you want to pot up some more to take home, please do.